I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. On the 5th of August 2019, India, the world's largest democracy, illegally annexed the internationally recognized disputed region of Jammu and Kashmir. The Indian government, led by the right-wing Hindu nationalist leader Narendra Modi, claimed that this was not an annexation but a move to make Kashmir one with India, so that the valley of more than 8 million people could prosper socially and economically. Seemed like a simple enough explanation. But as the Indian state gave this reasoning, it simultaneously imposed a blanket communications ban on Kashmir so that no information could come in or go out of the region. At the same time, while already having more than 700,000 Indian forces stationed in the region, it sent 40,000 more troops to the valley, making it the most militarized zone in the world. This happened 365 days ago. It's been a year since India annexed Kashmir. Today, Kashmir is still under a lockdown, communication is still blocked, and streets are still heavy with troops. Why, if this annexation is for the betterment of the Kashmiri people, is India not releasing its death grip on the neck of the valley, even 365 days later? On today's show, we center the Kashmiri narrative and explore what is happening in the valley. Joining us for this conversation is Ruwa Shah, who's a journalist, joining us from Istanbul. Ruwa, now, when we talk about Kashmir, the occupation of it goes back to almost 73 years, even more so before that. But when we talk about how the year after August 5th, 2019 has been different in terms of occupation, in terms of how it's being ruled, what do you see the main difference being?
Actually, August 5 is just one of the aspects of the entire history, colonial history of India in Kashmir and the occupation in Kashmir. As you said, it has been over 7 decades. India illegally occupied Kashmir in October 1947. So there have been different phases throughout, and the political spectrum and the status quo has changed many times since that date till today. But how was August 5 different is it was one of the most traumatic experiences for Kashmiris, given how India did what they did. I mean, the communication clampdown and the blockade of all the, access to internet, even mobile networks and television for a while. That was very traumatic for Kashmiris on the ground, and not letting anybody out, like the curfew, the force they used, the extra troops they brought into Kashmir to the already world's most militarized zone. It all added to the fear and anxiety. But otherwise, the occupational tactics were continuing always. It is not something new, and the August 5 incident cannot be looked at in isolation, because it was a part of the chronological events that happened, that India did with the arrest of all the resistance camp leaders beginning from 2017, and the military action on all the militants. Every day we see encounters between militants and Indian forces in Kashmir. So it all together brings us to the conclusion that the settler colonial project that India aspires to do in Kashmir is exactly the replica model of how Palestine and Israel has done in West Bank and Gaza. So it is exactly the same model being repeated. And now with the issuance of the domicile, with the, there are new laws being introduced, including the domicile law, according to which any non-Kashmiri, given that he or she has lived in Kashmir for a particular number of years, or there are some other conditions, will be given the citizenship of Kashmir, which is something that will make Kashmiris a minority in their own state, and it is a demographic change. Kashmir being an international dispute to which India, Pakistan, China, and Kashmiris are legally a part of, China now.
Ruwa, stay with me. Stay with that point. We're going to come back to the point of colonialism that you talk about, settler colonialism, just later on in the show. But before that, I do want to focus more on your story, because you don't just join us today as in the capacity of a journalist. You are also the daughter of a Kashmiri political prisoner, something that you have written about, something that you've spoken about. When we talk about your life, your family's instance, how does that fit into the larger scheme of things when we talk about justice in the idea, in the context of Kashmir, and when we talk about what has been happening in this past year?
Well, justice is a word that is alien to us and to me personally, because justice from this, as you said in the beginning of the program, the world's largest democracy is a farce, because I am the daughter of someone who is illegally imprisoned, and being a prisoner, a political prisoner, he is being denied all the rights that he has for his health and condition, even during those difficult times of the COVID. So we have seen a different side of we, as in most of the Kashmiris, there are thousands and thousands of political prisoners across Indian jails and even in Kashmir, inside Kashmir. So there are people who had absolutely no connection to anything, and they're still, spending their time in jail without any cases being proved in any of the courts, because those courts are occupational courts, right? They work for they are the part of the umbrella system, which is the occupation. So I do not expect anything from an Indian court.
Ruwa, and your father as well is a pre-trial prisoner, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, he's an under trial prisoner, and he has been charged of so-called sedition and waging war against India. And there is a 55,000-page charge sheet that has been produced in the court, which absolutely means nothing and doesn't prove anything. It has been 3 years. If there was something that he has done that is illegal according to your own constitution, also, let's say that as for the sake of the argument, why has it taken you 3 years to prove, and you have not been able to prove anything in the last 3 years? So they have delaying tactics in their courts. They delay the cases, particularly those of the Kashmiri political prisoners. If you can, we can go on naming the people and it will not end, because there are many families that are going through what we are going through as of now. So justice has always been a farce.
I'm sorry to interject here, but I think it is important, as we talk about this day and we talk about the sufferings of the Kashmiri people, it is important to talk about the personal experiences, to shed light on the human cost of what is happening. When you talk about you and your family, the experience, of course, is something that's unimaginable, and I'm sure it's painful to reflect upon as well. But to communicate what exactly is happening, your family does represent a huge majority of Kashmiri people and their experiences as well. Just take us through what it has felt like being a daughter and seeing your father in that position.
Well, from the beginning of my life, from my childhood, we have seen a very difficult life, which is something that I would not consider normal, because I would see my father being taken from home in the middle of the night with some, those armed cars. The images of those cars that come when they raid our house, they still haunt me, and I can't take off those images, and it's like a nightmare. And it's like we live in a dystopian state where every other day brings us a new suffering, a new trouble, and all we wish for every day is God should not make it more worse than it already is, but it somehow happens. And it has been since childhood, not only me, most of the Kashmiris. Like, imagine a child who grew up when both of his parents were in jail, or his father was in jail and he never came out, and his entire life he has lived without seeing his father being at home, only because there is an ideology behind those political prisoners that they are against the illegal occupation of Kashmir by India. So it takes a little while to understand what is happening, because as a child you don't know why is your father being arrested, why is he in jail, why are you meeting as a 3-year-old, why are you meeting your father in a jail, in a place where you cannot hug him, where there are those iron rods in between you and him. So it was very difficult in the childhood. And also there is a time when you start questioning, was this life chosen by our parents for us? I asked my father many times, why did you choose such a life for yourself and for your family? And he has always been very positive about it, and he said like this is the right path, and he did not impose any ideology on his children, on me particularly, but we saw it firsthand, and we believe in what he believes. So
Right.
it transcends from one generation to another in this way. When you suppress indigenous people fighting their righteous struggle, you cannot stop it at one generation. It will definitely transcend to the infinite.
I really can't imagine what you're going through, and I really can't imagine what the other children like yourself who have gone through similar situations have felt and have gone through. But it does remind me of how the Central and Jammu Kashmir administrations admitted in the Supreme Court that during August and September, during this duration in 2019, almost 144 children as young as 9 years old were also detained. This paints a very abnormal picture of what is happening. It definitely does drill the point home of how deeply rooted trauma would be.
Right, those are the official figures. As I said, I mean, there is an umbrella system that works, even the system within the state that some people think is self-rule, which it is not. It's clearly ruled directly from New Delhi, and whatever is happening, the order is written and executed and implemented by New Delhi in Kashmir. And those figures are not to be trusted because we have no official organization to check how many children were arrested. There are so many families. If you have read about the story of a family who were trying to prove that their son was dead during the COVID. This is one example of the system, how the system functions, because there is no truth on the surface. It's all under the surface, and they just keep piling it up with their use of force, military, and the mighty state that India is. It has used all its democratic, undemocratic, occupational, and colonial tools to occupy Kashmiris and suppress the life of Kashmiris from 70 years, and now from August 5, even more so. I just want to make one important point. August 5 cannot be looked at in isolation, because there were steps that were taken before this also, but it means something for those in Kashmir who were a part of the Indian electoral political system, who were called as the so-called mainstream, and I'd like to call them as the unionist. These are the people who have been deceived time and again, and yet they are the ones to swear by the Constitution of India. And those were the people mostly affected with August 5. But for the rest of Kashmiris who have always believed in the right to self-determination and plebiscite and the resolution of Kashmir issue, it was nothing new to them. We did not held any allegiance to Article 370.
Right. Now, something that I want to pick on is how you talk about the fact that the truth is so hard to find, as so much more gets put on top of it and it gets buried underneath. When we talk about this search for truth, this wanting to report what's happening on the ground, it's always been difficult when it has come to Kashmir. But after the 5th of August, things have become even worse. You as a journalist, I'm sure you're in contact with many journalists on the ground. How much more difficult has it been to report what's happening?
See, I have not myself worked for a long time in Kashmir. I have just worked once for 1 or 2 years when I was a student as an intern in many organizations. And at that time also, I understood the difficulties of being a journalist from a conflict zone. But now when we look at it from an outside perspective, it feels like there's a complete blackout, actually. No news is coming. The few pieces that are coming out from very, very brave and courageous people who are still writing when the authorities have done their best to, make them toe a line and coerce into a situation where they do not say anything. They have harassed journalists. A 26-year-old woman photojournalist, Masrat Zehra, was booked under the draconian terror law UAPA, which is the same law that my father is booked in. And not we'll keep naming and it won't end. It's Gauhar Gilani, Qazi Shibli is being detained for the second time on the day of Eid. He was arrested again after spending 9 months in jail last year. There's Kamran Yusuf. He spent 6 months in Tihar jail last year and 2 years ago. So there are, even like, these are the cases that appear on the surface, but there are many people that I know of are not even, are so scared for their lives, literally scared for their lives, that who get threatened at levels that they know that there's this. We know anything can happen in Kashmir, right? We have seen in the case of journalist Shujat Bukhari when he was assassinated. And also previously, many incidents have happened. So there has always been that fear. But I have spoken to journalists who say that this period from August 5, 2019 has been one of the most difficult periods for the media to function properly in Kashmir, particularly now with the new media policy being introduced in Kashmir, which makes things even more harsh. So the entire idea of tightening the noose around media is basically to suppress all the voices, muzzle the voices, let the truth not come out.
Right.
Because, Kashmir also became an internationally, it was kind of brought in the news again after August 5. So to control that, when Kashmiri young people are writing for the New York Times or Guardian and most of those international organizations that people around the world read. So it is something that
it was even more
India
essential to tighten around the media community within Kashmir. I take your point there, Ruwa, and thank you so much for taking out the time, talking to us about your experiences, shedding light on what exactly is happening, how families such as yours are experiencing the struggles within Kashmir. Joining us now is Mir Jawhar Green, who's a blogger, public speaker, and an educator. He joins us from Srinagar. Thank you so much, Jawhar, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, as we talk about what's happening in Kashmir, what's happening in this valley, it makes all the more sense to talk to someone who is there in the heart of Kashmir right now. You talked to us from Srinagar. Tell us what the atmosphere is like, what the political climate is like during this day, which is being deemed as the Black Day for Kashmiris all over.
The entire India is celebrating the abrogation of Article 370. Okay, we, the people over here, have been in curfew. Okay, strict curfew. So we are not allowed to move. You can see the raised wires all around. So there is complete lockdown. And the whole of the India is celebrating.
You talk about this contrast there, that India is celebrating while Kashmir is under lockdown. So the lives that are the most impacted by this are nowhere yet to be seen. Jawhar, as we talk about this, I think it's important to ask how you are communicating with us and how other individuals who are communicating to the outside world, what struggles they have to face to get to that part of communicating.
Okay, it has been an year now, okay, since high-speed internet was snapped. So we have been left out with 2G. It's through 2G only, okay, we communicate with the people around, and you can't actually, physically, you can't visit even your relatives, but through this mobile phones and through this 2G internet, you can communicate. Okay, while the whole world, especially since this COVID pandemic, okay, so the world actually switched over to remote learning as far as education is concerned. So we couldn't even do that because we are denied this, this high-speed internet. So this is the circumstances we are living over here. And before that, since August last year, okay, we have been living under curfew. We have been living in strict lockdown. Only in the month of March, we actually saw some movement over here for around 2 weeks. But later on, due to pandemic, again, the lockdown was imposed. And today, as of now, while I'm talking to you, we are under curfew. So life here, it's like as if you have been caged. Okay, so we are living in an open prison. So this is our plight,
Right.
what we have been suffering.
Jawhar, as you say and talk to us about the case of communication and how the only thing available is 2G internet, you're also an educator. And what has the impact of this been on education? Not just the fact that there is a lack of internet, but also that there has been a lockdown since August 5th, 2019.
As far as education is concerned, if we just talk about that, in any conflict zone, if you see, the greatest tragedy, the greatest casualty that you come across is education. Okay, so if you see or hear, even before that, from past 7 decades, we have been witnessing this. Even there are reports on it. According to India Spent, if you see, there was a report since July 2016. Kashmir schools and colleges, they have been shut on 60% of working days. So even before this abrogation of article that is 370 and 35A, so we have been having only 60% of 40% of working days or here. For 60%, the education institutions remain shut. Okay, so you can understand, given the circumstances, what would be the plight of our education or here. And in these then later on, from August 5, the schools and all educational institutions, including colleges and universities, they have been shut. Okay, only I told you before as well, I mentioned about it briefly. The schooling did actually happen for around 2 weeks in the month of March, after around 7 months of shut. Okay, so but there then as well, due to COVID pandemic, the schools have been shut. But what the world actually at global level, what did they do after that? They continued, they reached out, the students, the education institutions reached out to students, teachers reached out to students, educators reached out to students through online means. Okay, like Zoom, WhatsApp, and other Google Classrooms and other things. Okay, but so they switched it out to remote learning. But as far as our valley is concerned, Kashmir is concerned, we couldn't even do that. We couldn't even switch out to remote learning because you have
that is not an that's not an
whatever.
option given the state of the internet and given the communications blackout. Jawhar, just one last question to you. You deal with primary school children. When you interact with them, whatever opportunities you've had to interact with them since August 5th, what are their emotions? What changes have you witnessed in them?
They are actually going through a mental trauma. You might have even come to know through the media outlets that children, okay, there has been a spike in suicide rate over here from past few weeks, okay, past few months. Even small children of the age of 9, of the age of 13, okay, only a week before, a boy of the age of 13 from South Kashmir, he committed suicide. So this is the trauma the students are going through, and especially the students who come from, I mean to say, lower strata. Okay, they are at a greatest disadvantage in these hard times. Okay, there are even before this abrogation of Article 370, the children who come from elite class, okay, they can send their children out to other states where they can study, but the lower strata, okay, or here, the majority of the students, they cannot even afford that. So that is the plight over here. They have been going through a mental trauma, okay, because they couldn't meet their friends, they couldn't socialize with other students. Okay, so that is the trauma they have been going through, and they are no more interested in learning now. They have totally isolated themselves from the learning due to these continued breaks that we have been witnessing in their learning.
That's a very grim note on which we're going to have to thank you for joining us, Mir Jawhar Green. Thank you for joining us from Srinagar. Thank you for sharing your experience given the circumstances. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our conversation. Stay with us. Welcome back to our discussion as we observe the first anniversary of India's annexation of Kashmir. Joining us for this conversation now is Mr. Zaffar Qureshi, who's the chairman of Kashmir Campaign Global, which is an international NGO representing the aspirations of people of Kashmir who have been occupied by India since 1947. He's a Kashmiri living in exile. He joins us from London. Also joining us today is Professor Devoogd, who's a professor of neuroscience at Cornell University. He joins us from New York. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Qureshi, let me jump to you and talk to you about something that I would want you to put your own Kashmiri identity aside for just a second, and as an observer of international relations. When you see how the world is reckoning with Modi's initial statement, which was making Kashmir a part of India would help it to prosper, many people had doubts, but many people gave Modi the benefit of the doubt as well in the international community. Do you see there being a reckoning with that now?
Unfortunately, the move that Indian government unilaterally and unconstitutionally took in 2019 has kind of proven how reckless not just is the move, but the whole government and the Indian policy towards the people of Kashmir. Abrogating of this article not only violates the Indian constitution, but also violates the international treaties, the United Nations resolution, as well as the Geneva Convention 4 of the International Geneva Convention. So, yes, while India tried to mask this and portray it to the world that it is a democratic step that they took in order to benefit the people of Kashmir, the world has realized the realities on the ground. The only thing that has been happening is that people have become more determined to demand their right of self-determination, which is their basic fundamental right and promised by not just the United Nations, but India, Pakistan, and the international community for over 73 years now. This move has definitely opened up the eyes of even the stooges who up till last year stood by India in trying to be puppeteers within the Kashmir. They have even realized that India has never been sincere about resolving the issue of Kashmir, but instead of resolving peacefully, it is determined to create a genocidal threat within the Kashmir and trying to exterminate the indigenous people of Kashmir and replacing them with the Hindu migrants and refugees from East Pakistan and within India. We've seen this happening in the last 3 months. Over 300,000 domicile certificates have been issued. The Indian government has changed the laws within Kashmir that allows the Indian army to take over any land that they like and build settlements. What we're really seeing is a settler colonization with a definitive genocidal threat for the Kashmiris. And I'm not just talking about the Muslims, even though, not me, it's the stats, it's the Indian censuses that will actually, you can see and prove that Muslims have been the target in Kashmir, but this recent abrogation and the changes in the laws don't just target Muslims, but all over. Even the Jammus, who have always stood by the Indian government, have now realized what threat they're facing.
Right. Mr. Qureshi, now I remember talking earlier on in 2019 when this first happened to international experts and talking about this threat of ethnic cleansing, or as you talk about genocidal intent. And many experts said that we should be wary of putting that out, as that's not something that can be proven at this point in time. But you as a Kashmiri, knowing what is happening, seeing what has unfolded now, how do you try to bridge that information gap that many experts around the world continue to deny was going to happen or was happening at that time?
Thank you, Meshal. I think, you raised, and this was one of the points I've heard on quite a few programs saying that, well, actually, it's not a genocide stuff. The reality on the ground is that it's not just now. The issue of Kashmir has been outstanding since 1947. If we go back in the history, 1947, October and November, the Indian army, along with the Dogra forces, killed over 250,000 Muslims in Jammu, changing the demographic completely from a Muslim majority to a Muslim minority. Even in the recent years, since 1990s, there is a record and evidence of multiple massacres where Muslims have been specifically targeted in hundreds and killed. Today, what we're seeing is with an evidential proof where the Muslims again, the Kashmiris itself are again being targeted, and they've been replaced. New non-Kashmiris have been migrated into Kashmir to take their demography. If that is not genocidal threat, if that is not extinction of Kashmiris, then what is? My request to anyone who says it is not, I really sincerely suggest to them, come to Kashmir. Why doesn't India allow you to come to Kashmir? Whether that's Amnesty International, whether that's the United Nations, see for yourself on the ground what is happening to the people of Kashmir. Standing outside and not having a clarity in the reports and not being able to evidence it is not going to resolve the situation. You want to see what's happening in the ground, come to Kashmir, see how our people are being killed, targeted and terminated by the Indian government.
Right, those are all very pertinent questions that you put there. Professor Tim Devoogd, when we talk about the trauma this can cause to individuals, I want to quote what the Doctors Without Borders released in a statement earlier on before this lockdown, before August 5th, 2019, in which they said that 45% of the population in the valley has some sort of mental trauma. 95% of the population has experienced conflict-related trauma. Now, when we couple something like this that you as an expert would see from a distance, when we couple something like this with the anxiety of displacement, how do you think that would impact a community?
What I can speak to is the effects on the brain. And that kind of sustained trauma is something that's bad for the brain, very simply. Having high levels of stress hormones for a long period of time ultimately causes both changes in connections in the brain and can even cause loss of brain cells. How much more detail would you like?
Take us through how, if this was any other individual you were dealing with, what recommendations would you give to them?
Hormone system and our brain system are designed to be able to respond to a short-term stress efficiently and productively. If we saw a tiger, we would be able to do all the things necessary to run away from the tiger. Our nervous system and the rest of our physiology is not able to deal very well with stress that lasts.
Right. Well, Professor Devoogd, with that sustained amount of stress, would you have recommended someone to go to a counselor to seek professional treatment?
Yes, of course, but the counselor would say, find a way to be away from the stress. And the counselor would say, if you can find a way to be away from the stress, then you and I can talk about ways to restore productive patterns of behavior, to restore calm to your family.
Right. Mr. Qureshi, as we hear the Prof talk about this, the state of any individual who would be going through this kind of trauma, what recommendations would they receive from a professional? I do have two questions to you, which are firstly related to whether there are any services on the ground for Kashmiris to seek professional help for their mental state. And secondly, when we hear Professor Devoogd saying that a counselor would say, separate yourself from that trauma, separate yourself from that stress. Is that possible in the case of Kashmiris?
As the professor said, we can't actually get away from the stress and into a normal life until you're taken away from the source of the stress. Unfortunately, in Kashmir, we have got no such medical facilities by the government to help people overcome the stress. Instead, what we're seeing and what we're noticing statistically is that more and more youth whose schools have been closed, they've got nowhere to go, who have seen their parents being killed, their sisters, their mothers being raped by India are committing suicide. They're getting into depression. The international humanitarian agencies like Red Cross, Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders are not allowed to work in the Kashmir, even though it's a declared conflict zone, a disputed zone. There is no such facility, and this is one of our pleas to the international community is Kashmir is a recognized dispute. We, The Kashmiris need your help in every sense, whether it's a humanitarian or medical. And unfortunately, we're not seeing any tangible steps being taken by the international community to alleviate these sufferings.
Today, on this day that people are observing as a Black Day for Kashmiris, how are you as a Kashmiri living abroad trying to bring light to this issue? How are you mobilizing with your community members in order for there to be greater momentum about this issue?
Today, it is, as you know, it is being observed as a Black Day, and Kashmiri, especially the Kashmiri diaspora, and not just that, who've been mobilizing not just in the UK. We've got protests taking place in London, in Birmingham, in New York, in Washington, across Europe. Everybody in the diaspora has come together, not just with the Kashmiris, but all the peace-loving community, to stand together and make a message and give a message to the world that the people of Kashmir have been occupied by India for the last 73 years. We will not be silent. Our struggle for freedom is unjustified. There have been webinars organized. Kashmir Campaign Global has organized a global conference today at 5 p.m., which people can be invited. And there are many conferences been organized by the academics, by the politicians, by the humanitarian agencies, organizations like World Kashmir Awareness in the United States, Kashmir Civitas in the Middle East, Kashmir Campaign Global in Europe. Everybody is working under one banner, and that is freedom for the Kashmir under humanity, to make sure that we save Kashmiri means we'll be saving humanity.
Right. Professor Devoogd, as Mr. Qureshi states here, that what him and his community members are trying is to bring light to the fact that for 73 years there has been occupation. Now, when we talk about almost 7 decades of the type of trauma, he talked about the type of violence, he talked about children seeing their parents being killed, constant attacks on women with sexual violence, everything happening. I want to talk about intergenerational trauma, how something that's happened so much long before can continue to impact generations to this day and even onwards. Take us through what really happens to children and what happens to future generations in climates such as these.
Obviously, if children are exposed to stress, they become fearful. They become aware of the stress. They try to modify their behavior so that to either deny the stress or to get away from it. And those patterns of behavior can continue into adulthood. In addition, there is scientific data now saying that if a person is fearful, strongly stressed over a long period of time, there are direct genetic ways in which some of that stress can be passed on to children. That was observed in different populations in Europe after World War II, in populations that have experienced starvation, and I expect it would be true of populations that experience other kinds of stress as well.
Mr. Zaffar Qureshi, just one last question. You belonging to a certain generation, when you view what is happening to the younger lot, the youth, the next generations of Kashmir, especially when we talk about the new domicile laws being introduced, how things have become more and more suffocating within the valley. What is your greatest fear?
The greatest fear, unfortunately, is that the world is remaining silent. And the issue of Kashmir is not just about the Kashmiris alone. The issue of Kashmir has been outstanding for 73 years. It is an international dispute, which not only affects India, Pakistan, and China, but these three stakeholders who have been constantly involved in this. There's a bigger threat of a nuclear flashpoint. And if the world does not resolve this peacefully, we fear that this may engulf the whole world, and the peace and the stability of South Asia and across the world will not remain for long. We fear that we, the people of Kashmir, will be exterminated by the Indian forces and the Indian occupation, and yet the world remains quiet. We hope, you mentioned the next generation. I can categorically tell you the people on the ground itself from the Indian occupied Kashmir. We have not given up. We will not give up. Our hopes are high. No matter what we have, we will continue to defend our right of self-determination in every legal means that possible, in every way possible that we have. Whether it's through social media, whether it's through a pen, whether it's through sticks or stones, whatever we can. the right of self-determination is our basic fundamental right, and we will continue our struggle for the freedom of emancipation.
Right. And I think that's a message that is being reiterated again and again on this day by Kashmiris all over the world, that they will and they are and they will be committed to their right to self-determination, and they will continue the struggle for it. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Zaffar Qureshi, for joining us from London, taking out the time. Professor Tim Devoogd for joining us from New York. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.